Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Certificate Lifecycle Management for SSH. I'm Kristen Santos, Marketing Manager at Sectigo, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Presenting with us today is Jason Sirocco, CTO of PKI. Hey, Jason, how's it going?
Doing really great, Kristen. Nice to talk to you again.
Thanks, Jason. And we also have Tim Callan, Chief Compliance Officer. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Kristen. Always happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will remain on mute for the duration of the webinar, which we expect to be around 45 minutes, allowing for around 15 for questions and answers at the end. Feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and like I said, we'll get to those at the end. That's it for me. Without further ado, Tim, go ahead and take it away.
All right. So, Jason, you and I are here to talk about SSH certificates, but I think before that, we just wanted to explain a little bit about SSH.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a lot of folks who would be attending this webinar, when I was originally thinking about this, I could imagine that we have an enormously wide audience, everything from tech executives to the people who really work on the front lines and have their hands dirty in this technology on a daily basis. And so where do we meet in the middle? Well, we do have to start from the beginning, which is what is this? And we've probably all heard this term SSH. It stands for simply secure shell. And what is a shell? Well, it's whenever you've seen an administrator in Unix or Linux or even in Windows typing at a command line, typically that command line is what we call a shell. And so what is a secure shell? Well, there is a standards protocol that utilizes a key pair to authenticate to remote systems, especially Linux. Now you can imagine with the public cloud, there's an enormous amount of remote access to cloud-based Linux systems. Think about in Amazon, right? You have EC2 instances, right? For those of you who are familiar with that, but all the public clouds have the same thing. As well, you might be an enterprise that is basically logging into those computers remotely, authenticating. Your administrators are probably using secure shell to be able to authenticate. So to get really down into the brass tacks of, we could do entire webinars, Tim, on all the different features of secure shell and what it is and how to use it. We want to really concentrate here on how this thing authenticates, because it's the crux of what we're talking about.
Right.
Basically, at the point at which a first authentication occurs between a client and a server, there's a public and private key pair that's generated cryptographically. And of course, the public key is exchanged because, Tim, with everything else in PKI, with everything else with using a key pair, if you and I want to do business together, we have to exchange our public keys, and then we are then able to sign and encrypt various materials to each other and unencrypt and recognize signings, authenticate each other. That's the whole basis of it, and it's also the basis of secure shell. Now that's you see that bullet point in the middle, the bottom bullet point, keep the private key secret in the client. Boy, that's the hard part. That's the hard part. See, the thing is, these cryptographic key pairs really are just files.
Yeah.
And if the bad guy gets a hold of that private key, they can masquerade you. They can also masquerade as the remote server. And so therefore, it's kind of a scary thing. And all of a sudden, that key pair becomes, it literally is, it's a key to the door. It is something that you need to keep incredibly secure. And so therefore, the final point being, keep in mind that there's also a permission level typically associated along with this credential form factor of a key pair. And quite often that's a high level of privilege, because 99% of the time, the person, almost 100% of the time, the person who's actually logging in to perform tasks needs to perform very, very critical tasks on that remote server. So, Tim, that's a long overview, but there it is.
The capsule summary being public-private keys are far and away the most secure method of performing remote authentication, really, in any digital system. They are definitely a best practice, and for people with these kind of, super admin rights are a requirement, right? Damn near a requirement or a requirement. But as you said, the stakes are very, very, very high. So yeah. So traditionally a key pair. Go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, Tim. So really, as I say, the concentration on this webinar is about the issues around the key pair, which is
Yeah.
in traditional SSH, really all we're dealing with. The thing is, it is the most common way. There you can utilize a username and password. I definitely wouldn't recommend it. In fact, it's been an awfully long time since I've ever used that method.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of an easy default to use with SSH. And so after the exchange of the public keys, immediately you start having a problem, which is, you know, do you actually know which server you've logged into? And in fact, do you know which server you logged into, you're going to be logging into in the future, right? Because you don't, there is no central authority and there to be able to determine who really truly is who. There's possession of keys,
Mm-hmm.
but that's all there is. As well, um, if those private keys are compromised, obviously that's like losing the keys to your door. And the other problem is, of course, once those keys to the door are gone, it's not like you can just change the door lock. That if you're working in a system where the keys never change because there's no policy to do so, it's even more difficult and less secure than what the analogy we like to use, which is a key in a door. And so
Yeah.
therefore those infinite lifespans are real trouble.
Yeah, that's the biggest one. But then in addition to that, there's no real other policies, right? So the infinite lifespan is basically bad, but also, just like you said, there's no real policies around these keys at all. They're just keys, and they just do what they do, pure and simple.
That's it, Tim.
So
And
here you go.
so, yeah, and so Tim, if we were to try to take a look at the problem with traditional SSH, and keep in mind, this is SSH, I cannot emphasize enough. Any enterprise at all doing just about any kind of modern work in the public cloud or into servers you might have that you need to authenticate into remotely, all of these problems that we're listing here are real. The one that we're going to hit on the most is the first one, the unsafe user behaviors. But keep in mind, I'm going to refer to some of these other problems uh, to some degree in the rest of the webinar, especially this problem of key tracking. In other words, if your administrators are out there authenticating all over the place to the various servers, are you keeping track of what keys have actually been issued to who and where do they sit?
And
Now,
it says costly here, Jay, as if this is a problem that just could be solved with dollars, but it's not that simple. It could very well be costly and error prone and unreliable key tracking.
well, how do you even,
Yeah,
unauditable is what we could even write,
sure.
right? And so therefore, if it's not really auditable, if you don't really have visibility, it's not going to scale,
Yeah.
right? In other words, if it's something that has to be done manually, if it's something that you're going to ask the administrators who are already crunched for time, oh, by the way, you also have to manage your keys. Well, this thing is not, it immediately isn't going to scale. And that loss of control, Tim, is just scary to me, right?
Yeah.
The in the most basic sense, losing those keys, losing the private key, trading the public key with systems you don't necessarily want to is even a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as we said earlier, the traditional non-policy issue of just using a key pair is that these things never expire.
Yeah.
And so therefore that analogy of a physical key in a door, well, you can change the locks, but you can't with this.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's even less secure
Yeah.
than a physical door.
And this point about loss of control, it also, you wouldn't even know, right? If somebody did manage to steal a private key, there would be no way to detect that. There'd be nobody to be aware that that had even occurred.
You know, Tim, a lot of people wonder, hey, why does my monitoring system not pick up that I'm being hacked? Well, typically monitoring systems, if you're in possession of the key to the door, you're coming in.
Yeah.
And that's the problem. The loss of control is really complete. And you're not just losing control, you're losing control at the level of permissions that you have associated with that credential form factor, which is typically very, very high, sometimes all the way up to root, depending on what it is that administrator needs to do.
Yep, and it never expires. So, unsafe behaviors.
Tim, as I said, the thing we're going to be concentrating the most on in this webinar, otherwise we would go for days going through each of those points we talked about on that previous slide, is about the unsafe behaviors. Now, keep in mind, this first bullet point here, I wanted to bubble this right to the top. And let's admit the truth. These folks who are using SSH, the folks that are whose hands are dirty with it and they're doing the hard job of administrating Linux systems. These folks are crunched for time. They're also responsible for keeping the lights on in your critical systems. Keep in mind that even though these folks are using what really amounts to a security tool, this particular protocol, and they're handling key materials, do not make the mistake of associating these folks as being security focused. They are job focused, and that job is critical, and they're typically time crunched. In other words, we need to help these people as much as possible to be secure without it being onerous on their job. And so part of what we're going to be pointing out here, Tim, is quite often these administrators, whenever a security warning pops up, they're typically just saying, yep, let me in. Right? In fact, I bet you the vast majority of folks who are using SSH don't even understand or have never been fully explained. You know, when you say yes to a security warning message, what are the implications of that? Most of them are just saying, hey, I got a job to do, let me in. And we're going to get into that in a moment.
Well, especially when your other choice is just not do your job. I mean, it's kind of tough, right? Even if you didn't feel good about that situation, what else are you going to do?
There are, in traditional SSH, there are no ways to do the double checks. You're merely presented with, do you want to get in and take the risks, or do you just simply want to stop here? Yeah. Like that's a brutal set of conditions to give to an administrator. And so, you know, the really good tools don't typically exist with traditional SSH, but there are better ways, and we're going to get into that.
Yeah. Okay. So
keep in mind, Tim, just like with a set of keys, right? If you've handed off a set of keys to somebody and they're in possession of if that person changes positions and they really shouldn't have the level of permissioning that they have been previously provisioned with, or they've left the company, keep in mind that it's very, very difficult. Did you know that person might have one set of key pairs or multiple? And unfortunately, even after that employee has left the company, there are no policies associated with this, very little visibility or no visibility to it. And therefore, those keys that person is possessing still remain usable.
Yeah.
And of course, quite often, key pairs are group shared. And the private keys are shared amongst people. And quite often, because these authentication keys are so important, they're quite often hard-coded into things like Ansible scripts and Chef and Puppet scripts. And these things have been found by penetration testers and also malicious attackers for many, many years. They've been, spotted in GitHub source code. They've been spotted all over the place. So in other words, what you think is just sitting on the desktop is probably, if you were to really have full visibility to everything, you might be finding these keys all over the place where bad guys can find them. And I'll tell you, pen testers have a field day with this. And I go right back to the first bullet point, Tim. This isn't because your highly skilled tech administrator doesn't know what they're doing. It's because security is not their focus and they just want to get in. And therefore, putting the key into GitHub or into their Ansible script just seems like the right thing to do because it makes their stuff work. It's a totally wrong practice. It's not a best practice, but they quite often do it.
And these problems you see here are all exasperated by the limitless duration of a key, right? So if you knew that this key was going to stop working at a certain time, you would not code it into a script because you would know perfectly well that your script was going to break somewhere down the line, right? But because you feel like the script will work for as long as I want it, that's why somebody goes ahead and codes it in. And then that, of course, gets set and forgotten. And then, 8 years later, that script is still being used and it still has the key sitting there, right? And so that sort of thing wouldn't occur if these keys had policies and expiration and things along those lines. But because they don't, that's why you see these behaviors that we have listed on this page.
Tim, I wish I could have recorded you right there and just hit the play button every time we do a slide. It's literally the punchline to every slide.
All right. Well, I won't repeat myself over and over, but it's a good point to remember. So who are we connecting? Who are you connecting to?
In other words, Tim, you don't have to understand what's happening on the screenshot, which is essentially I wanted to show everybody, including people who will never ever see a command line in their professional careers. I wanted to actually show it to you, what it looks like. So when you see the SSH command being used here, I'm basically knocking on the door of a server, and I'm saying, "Hey, I've got a key, and I want to open the door of this particular remote server that exists at this address." And if it's my very first time, there's this issue of trust on first use. And in fact, what I'm challenged with is, "Hey, yeah, I see your key. But you know what? I don't know that this host is really who you think it is." And so what you're challenged here with is, all right, well, do you want to continue and take the risk, or do you just want to kind of cut out here? And I don't think I've ever, and I don't think too many other people who use the command line and use the SSH tool in Linux or Unix have ever typed in anything other than yes. Right?
Right.
And everything else is kind of problematic. And keep in mind, it's because of the fact that it's a raw key pair. As long as the other side of the equation happens to be in possession of, some other SSH private key, since I've asked to connect with it, it's saying, "Hey, yeah, I'll connect with you. But all you got to do is agree to accept my public key. And what else you're going to do here is accept me as a known host and as a trusted host inside your system." And in fact, Tim, if you go to the next slide, I'll show you what that looks like. So after you've clicked yes, the public keys are exchanged. And now, there's a whole bunch of gobbledygook here, what might look like that to the non Linux professional. But really what has happened here is that now there is a permanent change to your client. What I mean by your client is the administrator's computer that they're working with has now listed that target server as a known host. So in other words, there's a permanent trust decision that's made on first use. And typically it's not double checked and triple checked. And you know what? It shouldn't have to be doubled and triple checked. You should just know. Wouldn't it be nice to just know who that other side of the equation is that you're authenticating to? Unfortunately, because we're dealing with raw key pairs, there just is no good way to do that in traditional SSH.
Yeah, the only identity is the public key, right? That being unique, that's the only way you would identify it at all.
And I have no trusted authority to be able to centralize that list of public keys. It's just, well, there's a public key. I'm going to go and do business with it. I'm going to go and authenticate to it. even though that user really probably at that point has no idea what that is.
All right. So what's the solution, Jay?
So Tim, I love what you said earlier about policies, and especially the one important policy that we cannot say enough. And like I say, we could almost run Tim's tape every time we do a slide, because the most important of those policies is that expiry policy.
Absolutely.
Now, how do you give policies to key pairs? And the example I like to have used for years and years now is certificates are essentially an envelope for key pairs. And what's written on the envelope is the policies that you want to associate with those key pairs. And that's a way of saying, hey, this key pair has a lifespan, and that lifespan is limited. And in fact, past a certain time and date, do no longer please trust this key pair.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's really, really good. Of course, the problem that you bring to yourself now is that there is some sort of lifecycle management that's needed. And if we think about this now, a lot of folks are thinking that traditional SSH could benefit greatly by instead of using key pairs alone, putting those key pairs into certificates. And what's great, Tim, is that this really is now part of the standard,
Mm-hmm.
and there's not a lot else you have to do. So all you really have to worry about now is things you might not have in the past, which is the certificate lifecycle management itself. So in other words, the cert isn't hard. It's the management of the cert you now have to work with to be able to gain all of these security benefits and usability benefits that certificates bring to you.
Right.
So the second bullet point here, I think, is incredibly important because it goes back, Tim, to remember we talked about that bullet point of the costly key tracking, or the unauditability of key pairs. Yeah. As soon as you have certificates that have been issued, you now have visibility and auditability, even to things such as, hey, what was the cryptographic algorithm used to generate the key pair? Mm-hmm. Right? Who was it?
When was it generated?
When was it generated? All the things that you would do, think of any governance program worth a grain of salt is going to ask all those questions. Yeah. And those questions are answered by turning those key pairs into certificates, wrapped inside of policy, gives you all that visibility for governance purposes. Right. So you get the expiry date, and as well, right, the sets of tools. Remember, we had talked earlier about that poor user has no way to know what they're actually authenticating to, especially on the trust on first use. Well, the CLM tools, because of the fact that they're associated with a certificate authority, all those tools that are necessary, not just for your risk officer and your CISO, but the tools that are necessary so that your administrators no longer have to be security professionals in themselves, those are also given to you by a CLM. And so, Tim, this is just the beginning of thinking about, hey, SSH can be done a new and better way. And thankfully, it is part of the SSH standard now. Yeah. And there it is, right? It's built in, it's ready. And so therefore, if you're today using a standard open SSH client, right, using, the SSH tools that are part of the distribution of probably your Linux distribution, your Unix distribution, there's, without any additional software investment, without having to teach your users much more at all other than the tools they're already using, thankfully, over the past few years, large organizations have adopted this, made it part of SSH, and I believe, Tim, this will continue to grow, and the adoption of this will flourish. And so therefore, let's not think about this as being something other than the tools you're already using.
And so where SSH certificates are not being used, and rather it's traditional raw key pairs, do you attribute that to just lack of awareness?
Uh, Tim, I think it's pretty new.
Yeah.
And so therefore, yes, it's lack of awareness, but I can fully forgive anybody whose nose is buried in their job
Hmm.
to not have seen this. And this is the big call to arms here,
Yeah.
which is, you don't, yes, you can go much further than we're saying, even in this particular webinar. I wanted to make the point that even without swapping out the tools you're using today, you can start using certificates rather than using raw key pairs. And that might be a new idea to a lot of folks who use SSH.
Yeah, and might shore up their security profile considerably. All right. So benefits of certificate-based authentication. We've touched on some of these, but let's run down the list.
Yeah, Tim, this is, it looks like a long list, and I'm going to keep it to the bare minimum because, we have hit a lot of this already, but we hit it in the problems. What
Yeah.
we, this is the flip side of, if you actually use certificates for your SSH authentication rather than just the raw key
Mhm.
pairs, that, you remember the screenshots we showed earlier where you were given this tough problem of, hey, you trust me, right? Just type yes and we'll log in together. Well,
Yeah.
that problem of trust kind of goes away, and it goes away because of the fact that the chain of trust starts with a certificate authority.
Right. Was it issued by the certificate authority or was it not? If it was, it's trusted, and if it was not, it is not. Right. It becomes very clean and easy, and the regular user doesn't have to ask themselves that question. Right. You know that somebody who was focused on this worked it out at the time, and that it's therefore it's right.
And so who is that you're talking to at the other end? Well, that would have been somebody who was provisioned with a public key that would have been issued by a CA,
Yeah.
or at least signed by the CA. And so therefore, you can trust who it is you're talking to, at least much more so than you did when it was just a raw key pair.
Yeah.
Of course, the second bullet point is the one we've been hitting on the hardest here, which is the fact that you can set an expiry date. And
Yeah.
so therefore, imagine if your highly provisioned root level permissioned key pair can now expire after the job is finished. Like, in
Mm-hmm.
other words, a just-in-time credential. That's fantastic. Think about how much that lowers the problem. In other words, that key, that little file that's sitting there, the certificate, even if it's sitting in a very, very unsafe location, it just happened to be, found by a pen tester,
Right.
found by somebody who's malicious. Well, if it was found after the expiry date, they're not going to do much with that certificate, which is fantastic for you.
Yeah, and even I mean this idea of a customizable expiry date that runs out after you're done with the job is terrific. But even if that seems like an advanced maneuver, just putting any kind of reasonable time limit on these things
Correct.
is a vast improvement over I don't know if this key was ever copied and it exists who or where and whose possession or what happened with it. And any time in the foreseeable future, as long as I'm still using this system, at one day some unknown party might decide to use it to gain access between now and when I sunset the system. Because that's what we have today. So
Tim,
even
you got
right?
it. No, Tim, you've got it, man. You've got it completely. Don't let me tell you when you should set your expiry dates. You have to think about that. In fact, you and I, Tim, have podcasted on that. You and I have
Right.
done
Yeah.
webinars on that very subject. And so talk to security professionals. What's a good expiry date for your use case?
Yeah. And
But
even if
keep
you
in
make it nice and long, even if you say I'm going to give it a year, it's still better than forever.
so Tim, as soon as you have an expiry date, that means you need a renewal.
Uh-huh.
And so therefore, that means some form of maintenance. And you don't want to have to add a headache to that poor, administrator's life. And so therefore, lowering the maintenance, keeping it as easy as possible.
Yeah.
This is what not just certificates give you, but certificate lifecycle management.
Right. And the whole certificate ecosystem. I mean, certificates are so fundamental. The good thing about certificates is so many people have been using them for so long for such mission critical things that once we get into the world of certificates, the tools and processes and knowledge that are available to you are vast,
No, that's it. That
right? And
you've
are
got it.
great.
So Tim, that think about if you're in the business of governance, you now have a way of having visibility in a single pane of glass to all aspects of those certificates that have been issued, where they've been issued, when they've been issued, and all the way down into really, into the minutia of what was the cryptographic uh,
Right.
algorithm used,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore, it's not just lowering the maintenance problem to the user, but also giving enormous power to your risk officers, to your risk officers and people who are actually worried about this on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if you're giving them those tools, you are reducing costs in many ways. And Tim, I at the bottom
Mhm.
bullet point that I really love here is,
Yeah.
we talked earlier about user leaves the company or user changes their jobs. The
Yeah.
ability to revoke and replace these certificates.
Yeah.
Boy, certificate lifecycle management, this is what it's offering you. So I wanted to go back, Tim, to those original 5 bullet points, right? User behavior, key tracking, the problem of scale, the loss of control, the fact that the keys never expire. I hope what you're seeing here is that the certificate-based authentication for SSH kind of ticks every one of those boxes.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Tim, this is something a lot about. We do want to touch on this, but what does certificate lifecycle management look like? Well, here's an example from Sectigo. We call it the Sectigo Certificate Manager. And this really is, and I love that word automation, right? A fully
Yeah.
automated certificate lifecycle management solution. And think about the visibility that this is giving to you for all of your certificates, not
Right.
even just SSH. This is for publicly trusted certificates, SSL, other certificates you're using for other use cases, for authentication, for DevOps, for signing, for you name
Yeah.
it, all of your certificate types, Tim.
And I think you've handed me a couple of things here I want to run with, if I may, for just a
Please.
minute. The first one is that, but back to our point on the previous slide about how this is an example of the robustness that you get when you move from raw key pairs to certificates. And it's just the point I said before. The world has invested tremendously in making sure that certificate-based identity works correctly. And its systems, its software, its processes, its protocols, its standards, and all of these things are there because we need them, or our digital world will stop running. And so we have an entire globe of digital processes that have put pressure on making sure that these processes and software and et cetera and protocols and standards work correctly. And you get the benefit of that when you move to certificates automatically, right? And the benefits are huge. And so that's point number one. And this is a perfect example, right? You can go and you can get any number of off-the-shelf solutions that will do this for you, including ours, right? Which is complete, full features and robust and complete. But there's just a whole world, a whole ecosystem of solutions out there. So that's point number one. Point number two that I think is great that you just brought up now, Jay, is that once they're SSH certificates instead of raw keys, you can put them into a bucket of processes and I'll call them digital objects that you need to deal with, which is all your other certificates. So your organization's doing certificates. You just are. You have TLS certs. You probably have client certs. You have, like you said, document signing, email certificates, etc. Bunch of these things, code signing, all kinds of certificates that you're dealing with, and you have rules and processes and governance and policies and audits and software and trained individuals. And all of these things deal with certs. And now all of a sudden, it's just simply another type of certificate. And so it can easily fit into this area that is scrutinized, that is well managed, that has dedicated resources, that has dedicated systems and platforms, that has reporting and auditing and monitoring and governance. And suddenly, instead of having these keys that are just floating around, and I guess it's sitting on some developer's laptop, I hope it doesn't get stolen, down to I'm in this whole organized, rigorous, monitored world. And that benefit is huge as well.
Very well said, Tim.
All right, so I get excited. All right, so yeah, this is more I think about our solution in particular, right, Jay?
Yeah, that's it. And so therefore, I think what's important to note about Sectigo, and this is the reason why both Tim and I are excited about this, it's because of the fact that it's not on the slide here, but this isn't just about, hey, today's use case. It's about even the use case we haven't even thought about yet. By going this way, authentication isn't going away. In fact, you're doing more authentication than ever. And that's the one thing we know will be occurring in the future. You're just going to be doing more and more and more of it. So not only are you scaling the numbers of certificates, you're scaling the numbers of use cases you're having to deal with. And so keep with that in mind, a lot of people ask me, hey, Jay, how secure really is this? Well, keep in mind, this is being done by folks who are in the public trust space for 20 plus years. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, using things to root the CA inside of HSMs, you're talking about people who this is all they do, right? This isn't security as an afterthought. This isn't security as, we just kind of figured out what an HSM. No, these are people who probably know how to set this up better than anybody else that exists, and you're not having to deal with it. The people at Sectigo are dealing with this, and they've given you this ability to do certificate lifecycle management on top of probably one of the most secure backend systems that you can imagine. And so therefore, your ability to extend trust from a certificate authority hosted by Sectigo is one that you're going to be able to trust yourself as well. And so therefore, go ahead to the next slide, Tim. Yeah. Right. How does this really work? Well, it all starts from, hey, I got to knock on the door of a remote server. And so therefore, I'm going to go through step 1, 2 happens really quickly, which is basically your system is basically saying, I need to log in to another system. Well, that CA, when it recognizes you, will say, yep, I know who you are. And therefore, I'm going to provision you with what's necessary to get into that server. In other words, that public key event. So think back to that, that screenshot, Tim. I think we had 2 screenshots of what it looked like at the command line. Well, all of a sudden, that command line with that really ambiguous, hey, do you trust me? Just say yes.
Yes, no,
that goes away. And so this slide here explicitly shows that the trust is being enforced by the certificate authority itself. And therefore, even though we do break it down into step 1, step 2 with the user request, the assigned certificate, and step 3, right, which is basically the authentication step, this is all happening in a blip. Yeah. And all the trust that's occurring, there is no longer going to be any ambiguous, hey, do you just trust me? The trust is extended from the CA.
And so therefore, clear, Jay, in this scenario, the CA is owned by your enterprise. This is correct. Your private PKI that you're operating.
100%. And we really should make that point. Most of you who are thinking about certificates are probably familiar with what we call typically SSL certificates. And SSL certificates are typically issued by a public certificate authority and put onto web servers. This is different in the sense that the CA is by your definition. Mm-hmm. And what I was saying on the previous slide about working with a security partner like Sectigo is basically helping you to set up that private CA.
And so if I'm a large enterprise, chances are very good that I have one or probably more than one private CAs I'm operating already. Would I be using one of those, or am I going to create something that's unique for my SSH keys?
You know what's interesting here, Tim, is I would say that it depends.
Okay.
If you're using, let's say there's a very well-known CA out there, Microsoft CA,
Yeah.
right? MSCA connected to your Active Directory. Well, here's what's interesting, Tim. We can actually augment that because typically, yes, it can issue certificates. The problem with the Microsoft CA, though, is that it doesn't know anything really outside of that Microsoft world.
Right.
And so what Sectigo can give you in that case is, yeah, if you want your issuance to be from MSCA, but you want to have visibility and this ability to augment into non-Microsoft authentication schemes, like what we're seeing on this slide, we can give you that as well. And so therefore, the shorter version to the answer is, yes, you can, but there are things you would need to do in order to be able to utilize an existing private CA.
Gotcha. Cool.
And this is just how it looks. We don't have to spend much time here except just to just show you, you can now associate and provision and just have visibility to all the different servers and users that are using these certificates.
And you're in a nice interface with dashboards and reporting and searchability and all of that stuff that makes life better.
And here's something, Tim, I just want to throw this idea out there. What this slide is, I can tell you right now, anybody who's a hardcore Linux administrator is looking at this and going, oh man, you're telling me I got to learn another screen? The user probably never has to see this. This is called, to me, a separation of duties. The Linux administrator can go do what they do best. What this is for is your risk officer, for the people working in your security operations, for your CISO, for your CIO, for your, the risk officer, whoever it is that's worried about governance. This is their screen to look at what's going on.
Got it. That's good. That's a good point. All right. Well, okay. I think we're ready for questions, Kristen?
Yes, we are ready. We got a couple questions in. First up, what would a reasonable expiry time period for SSH?
Funny, Tim, we were just talking about that. I would say, you know what, Tim, in the public trust world, let's start there. What is it right now in the public trust world?
Well, it's 1 year to 3 years maximum, depending on the nature of the certificate.
So that, to me, that would be
certs are 1 year.
Right. And so therefore, Tim, to me, that would be your absolute maximum, the most you'd ever put for an SSH certificate. So therefore, something less than the 1 year is the blunt answer. But to me, you could shorten it all the way up to a just-in-time certificate, which means as soon as you've done the job, maybe you even just revoke the cert. Maybe however, what you could also do is to say, well, look, I'm gonna make 1 day certificates.
Yeah.
Or I'm going to make 2 day certificates and leave it at that. Right. Somewhere between
this. Yeah, we've seen this with other types of certs where people say, what is a time frame in which 99.5% of the time the job is going to be done? And I'm going to have my certs revoked by then. And 1 time a year that I need to make an exception, I go ahead and I generate another one, right? But that is a practice that I think we've seen adopted, and it seems like it's a pretty smart practice.
Now, we would need to look at the use case, specifically to tell you, hey, you don't want to overlap while you're doing the job and, make the cert inactive. That's a bad thing. Sometimes you're using authentication for other means, and therefore it needs to last more than a day, more than a week, more than a month. Yes, we get it. But the point is, at least you have that capability.
Yeah, and you could also change that by the nature of the task, right? I could say tasks of this nature should be done more or less instantly, and I'm going to cap these at a day. Tasks of this nature are different, and I'm going to cap these at a month, right? And you do have that kind of control because it is your CA, and you can do whatever you want with these things.
Got it.
So let me just take a second to pitch our podcast before we get back to the questions. So if you like what you're hearing in this kind of topic, this kind of subject matter, and this kind of detailed examination and back and forth and QA and all of that, Jason and I run a regular podcast. It's called Root Causes, a PKI and security podcast, and we dive deep into all kinds of subjects around digital identity, certificates, PKI, CAs, encryption, etc. And we have hundreds of episodes available today. We're putting out new episodes almost every week. And you can find us just by searching on Root Causes PKI, where you listen to podcasts. Please come and join us. With that, Kristen, next question.
Yeah, no worries. Do I need a certificate policy for SSH certs?
So, geez, Tim, do we need a CP, right? Which is what we call it, the typical wording.
Yeah.
You know what? Because it's a private CA, most private CAs, you typically want to say what that CA can and cannot do. So I think if you're a governance person in your company and you're setting up a CA, you want to set up policies. And so therefore, it doesn't have to be as complex as, say, Tim, as a Sectigo public CA.
Yeah.
But you should be able to at least say, hey, this is issuing certificates that does this, and here's the things it can do, and the things it should do, and the things that it will never do. And that should at least be written down on paper, is I think the answer to that question.
Policy is a squishy word, right? You and I just did a podcast on squishy words in the PKI world. We didn't include that one, but policy is a squishy word in that, to some degree, when you're a public CA, you might have a 100-page document that details in enormous detail exactly what you do. And that would be a certificate policy. You're not going to probably have that for your private CA unless you are real hardcore, right? But somewhere deciding how you're going to do these things and what you're going to do and what you're not, and writing that down so people know what the expectations are, and making sure that you're following those expectations, which presumably you have for good reason. Somewhere you want to do that. I agree.
Perfect. On to the next one. Will there be command line tools for this offering?
Short answer is yes, absolutely. And so in other words, some of the tooling used at the administrator level to be able to do certificates, in air quotes, do certificates. Yes, in fact, the interface to be able to get those things issued, that earlier slide we showed where the authentication is actually occurring because of a request for, hey, I want to log into this server and I want to get the public key. Yeah, that at the command line, those tools are actually available right now for your administrators to start using.
Awesome. Next and final question. Does SSH certificates or do SSH certificates avoid the classic host warning message when you first authenticate to a server?
You know what? The beautiful answer to that is yes. And keep in mind, in fact, we just mentioned it, which is that at the command line, it's every time you do that trust on first use, you're given that really ambiguous question of, hey, do you want to just trust me blindly, or do you just want to walk away and not authenticate? Well, typically you're going to say yes to that. In order to get your job done, you're taking a lot of risk. And by using SSH certificates instead of traditional raw key pairs in SSH, you eliminate that problem, because it's not you that has to somehow blindly trust what you're authenticating to. You can now actually rely on trusting a certificate authority that has extended that trust rather than having to deal with it yourself. Yes.
Perfect. Well, guys, that's it for questions. As always, thank you, Jason. Thanks, Tim. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, Kristen.